Didn't do a session today on creating AI policies for K12 and higher ed. This is going to be a super hands-on one. Like it's actually like Lance and I are going to be having a conversation that is going to be hopefully very productive for you all. We want you to be involved. So as Vicky's already started, let's say where you're from. We've got Woodland Park, where it's actually my mom who's visiting my 90-year-old grandmother. Hi, Mom. We've got Tennessee. We usually have a pretty international crowd. This is your network. The chat is there for you to reach out, understand, and share resources. It's really exciting to have you all here, and I'm sure you have some great ideas. So I see Puerto Rico, I see Glasgow, very nice. Got Portugal, Savannah, Sydney, love it in the early morning. I love my early morning peeps. And yeah, so this is a great opportunity to share resources. We'll be sharing resources along the way, but you also probably have a great resource that you can share or a question. So the first 40 minutes or so of the session will be us talking about these best practices. And then what we'll do is we'll put it over to you for questions. So this is part of our AI Launchpad series. Like I said, you think we would have figured out the technical difficulties, apparently not. But this one is focused on creating AI policies. We'll be doing a session on running a PD at your school, as well as next week, we'll be focusing on formative feedback, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And so I'm going to come off share and I'm going to introduce Lance. So Lance, please tell us who you are, what you do, and then what was your first interaction with generative AI?
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. Super excited to be here with folks. So yeah, I'm Lance Eaton. My title, it recently changed, so I still fumble through it, is Director of Faculty Development and Innovation at College Unbound. And I've been thinking about and playing around with AI for a couple of years and it been interesting conversations, and then generative AI, particularly in the form of ChatGPT, dropped last November 30th, and so we're coming up on a year. I very quickly started to hear about it, started to play with it, started to think about what are the implications for students and what are the implications for faculty and what does this mean for teaching and learning, and that really started a huge set of things that we will probably get more into, but a lot thinking about how in my roles do I support faculty and students in finding useful ways for this and navigating some of the more trickier aspects of it.
Great. And what was your first interaction with generative AI?
Oh, it was just playing on ChatGPT in December, just trying to get a sense of what it is and how to use it. And I remember very early on, I was keeping a chat log before they had the links and stuff. And so I was sharing that on my blog where each week I was just going in and here are these questions I'm asking and what kind of results is it giving? And at times was both intrigued and just oh, that's a big nothing burger.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. So for those that haven't met me before, I'm a former educator. I was a high school biology teacher in the Bronx. I have a lot of experience in K12, so I'll be the K12 kind of voice in this conversation, where Lance is really going to come from that higher ed perspective. My first time with ChatGPT, if you know me, you know I hate rubrics. And it's just such a funny thing to hate, but I think they're really important, but they're very hard to create, especially consistently and of high quality. So my first ever, I didn't even start with the basics of playing around. I went right to the meat and I was like, if it could build me a rubric, I'm on board. And when it built me a rubric with a badly worded prompt in about 10 seconds and formatted as a table, I realized that, I needed to start thinking about this strategically. And so as we talked about, this is our 13th or 14th webinar in a row, which is pretty crazy to have at this stage. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a question about why do you think that AI policy is the place that institutions, higher ed institutions, should be spending time on right now?
I'm unmuted. Good. Yeah, so my mind went there because it's such a dynamic tool and its possibilities are as big as its problematic aspects. And faculty were just last fall was maybe the first semester many faculty thought we were back to normal, whatever we want to call normal after COVID. And so this idea that they would just be able to figure this out or not need guidance and support or something to respond against, I think was really important for me. Was it came out as I said, November 30th, December, faculty are sitting there trying to wrap up the semester and maybe have a break where they're actually get to see family and breathe and do stuff, and then it's the semester starts right in January. And it just felt really important for me to figure out at my institution and help others figure out like, well, what can we put out there? What can we have that's at least some start? Because faculty weren't going to necessarily be ready to have their own policies and their syllabi, and so they wanted to fall back on something. In a lot of the policies at institutions around academic honesty, like they didn't actually hold, because if you look at them, a lot of them focus around like buying a paper from a paper mill or copying and pasting from like a source that's on the internet, right? Like when you play around with it in those, like there's this interesting middle ground that generative AI wasn't giving any, like wasn't being addressed in those. And I think just in general, knowing that faculty can look to their institutions for help and support is something that we should be able to do and spend time on and actually help them so they don't feel like they're out in the wilderness on their own.
Yeah, no, I think there's so many good points there. And I do think that it does feel like the wilderness. And sometimes we think about policies being constrictive, right? Like it's going to constrict our growth or our creativity. But when we don't have policies for something so new and transformative, it creates a level of uncertainty, right? What we've done is we've created this space in which who, what, how, what does it look like? What's going to happen? And I had a conversation with a higher ed organization that essentially had to say, like, we'd made a decision not to put any wording around generative AI into our syllabi in January. And what ended up happening by the time that it came to the end of the semester, kids used it for their essays and their final exams, and there was nothing that really could happen. And in fact, there are the faculty that just kind of said, the semester's gone. And I think that that was really fascinating for me to understand. And I think it had the same level of impact on the K-12 at the same rate because of all kinds of reasons. Like, students are, early adopters, but it's much more common in higher ed and college, and the types of exams and, final exams are really at risk in like starting, I think, in like maybe 7th or 8th grade, but really in higher ed. And so for us, like, I think a lot about what we do is that there has to be this level of like setting a base of understanding of what these tools can do and what they can't do, and then giving a structure to what is appropriate use. And so, I think that kids that are going to plagiarize are going to figure out a way. They might spend more time cheating, like that it might take them more time to cheat effectively than doing the work. And who knows what that student's going to end up becoming one day, and that kind of creativity about getting around that. And it's something that's been through the dawn of time, whether it was a cheat sheet or, maybe it was a tablet where you had your cheat sheet back in, Roman times, Socrates asking you a question and you have your, like, my answers written down on that tablet. But I think that what's really interesting right now is that this is so much faster and the capabilities are so much vaster, right? That we really need to think about building that kind of common language.
Yeah, and let me just add that was for also the catalyst for us was in December. A colleague, Autumn Caines, she's amazing. She's been a great collaborator in thinking about this. Like, she had a student who, or she had one or two students who she thought might have used it. And like there was this moment where we're in conversation, like me and her in conversation, and we're like, on the one hand, we're like, okay, first of all, trying to figure that out is going to be impossible because like we even knew at that time the tools weren't going to be great. AI plagiarism tools weren't going to be great, but we also just kind of like looked at each other for a moment, or just like, man, like that student gets some credit for creativity, like so quickly seeing the tool and figuring, oh, I can use this. If they did, like, we still don't know, but it was that jump started the conversation of like, well, what are our faculty going to do when they come up against these in ways that, like, at least out of my institution, like a false positive, wrongly accusing a student of using it is just antithetical to our mission. And so really making sure we could find that space to like give them the support to help figure it out and know that like it's a moving target. And I think that's where a lot of institutions were hesitant. It's like they're waiting for the dust to settle. And it's just like, it's not. And so like you've got to figure out something and know it's going to be messy, and also know like it's better than nothing, because nothing is leaving folks like out to dry figuring it out on their own.
Absolutely. And I'm going to share a document, like a little thing we shared a couple of weeks ago on what we've been seeing to that point, Lance. And so there are kind of four kind of buckets of what we see about what's happening. And the first is this idea of waiting. And so just like you said, moving targets, changing very quickly, maybe we'll just wait and, it'll start to make more sense, or maybe there'll be regulation, or there'll be some kind of support from our district or from the faculty, like the accrediting bodies or something along those lines. But what happens is like that means that there is this kind of open playing field of like no clear guidance. And also like you're either going to try to catch up or like you said, wipe your hands of it because it's really, really difficult to understand. So they see that camp. The next is the band camp. And I know that's happened, it sounds like band camp, but band camp, which has happened, let's say New York City DOE at the K12 level is a great example. Or we've seen that some universities have also tried to ban. What's always really funny is they try to ban only ChatGPT, not realizing that there are hundreds of these tools out there that are proliferated. And, we have to talk about generative AI, not ChatGPT, when we talk about these tools. But what can happen is exactly that false positive or false negative. We know, okay, if you guys walk away with one thing tonight, besides the fact that Lance is really cool, it has a lot of great things to say, is that AI detectors do not work. And I don't care what Turnitin says. They put out a paper recently with a 0.7% false positive rate. That is, if there are 10,000 students, that is 700 students that have been accused of plagiarizing when they have not. And I bet you right now, a lot of those students are those that are non-native English speakers, or those that take creative approaches, or those that are really trying really hard to create something in a model. And so there's really a huge problem here, because what we're creating is like a level of suspicion, but we're also pitting students and teachers against each other, which we all know as educators has never worked. You will never have learning when you're fighting with your students. That is an unwritten rule. The next is the self-guided piece, which is at least a step in a direction that says, hey, like use it, like every, teacher or every faculty member can choose their own way of approaching this. So maybe you put something in your syllabi, maybe you adopt it, maybe you don't. And that is at least a step in the right direction, but it is also, again, fending for themselves and also without clear guidance. So what we suggest is institution-wide. So that really is this idea of like setting these clear guidelines that are really actionable and understandable. I would rather you have one sentence or two sentences that everyone can repeat back to you about a policy than nothing in place. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect, but it is going to be something that everyone understands the basic guidelines, and we can move past uncertainty into action, into change, into like actually creating a better system, which is really the opportunity that generative AI has. So what do you think about this? And like, where do you think that you see most of the schools that you work with on?
Yeah, gosh, lots of feels on this. The weight, it reminds me of the pandemic, because I've thought a lot about this. I started playing around with hybrid flexible courses in like the mid 2010s. Like the ability to do hybrid or remote or things like that, we had that for a decade prior, and institutions didn't want to try it out or really like plan for that. So what happens? The pandemic happens, and like lots of people's semesters are just like, pardon my language, but like thrown to shit. And that is something that like we're seeing again. I think a good amount of institutions are waiting. Like I don't know how an institution there's plenty of institutions that have yet to have any policy. We're in the fall semester, like that to me seems it does not seem there a smart strategy. Banning abstinence just is not like it didn't work in prohibition, it didn't work in the it didn't work with drugs, it didn't work with sex education. Like that is not a way of education. It feels just a wrong approach. I think in higher ed, I think the self-guided and the institutional wide and the policy that we created is the balance of those two, because this is where I think institutions are going to be really hard pressed to come up with things that are like universally applicable across all the domains that they're teaching. And so like, yes, they want to have a policy, but if that policy also doesn't allow for that academic freedom, doesn't allow for in different contexts for faculty to tweak it. Now, what they shouldn't be tweaking is like what the the accountability process, right? The like if a student is like ends up using it in an incorrect way or something like that, like they shouldn't be addressing that, but they should be able to kind of contextualize like in this class, like you can use it to this degree, or you can't use it because like this course is focused on that, or you can only use it in like the ideation stage. So for me, what I've seen the best institutions doing is balancing those two versus kind of choosing one or the other, because I think it gets a lot more complicated across the different types of courses in higher ed.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, I think that the way we think about it, especially for K-12, is that there's a way to create like a worked example or an appropriate, inappropriate use spectrum that can be independent to every educator, right? In every context. And I think that that's where we see the individuality of this, is that what we want to do is we want to create this common language, but we also want to make sure that it works in context. So here's the kind of tips we think about, and I'd love to get your perspective as well. But I talk a lot, like one of my favorite things I used to do, Lance, when I was in Australia, I was in all kinds of schools across the country. I saw some Gold Coast people. I was in Brisbane, I was in Perth, I was in all over. And what I used to ask a room of educational leaders was, does everybody in your school community have the same definition of learning? And not once did anyone raise their hand, not once. And I said, if you went out to the street and you did like 100 people, what is school for? I bet you that a lot of them are going to say learning. And I think that this is what we really miss a lot of times. We don't take the time to set a common understanding and language of what we're trying to do. And so when we talk about generative AI, what does that actually mean? What does academic integrity mean in this new world in which it's really easy to have a paper written by a bot, and and it's something that has never been possible before? But I think that that's a really strong place to start. And then what we want to do is exactly what you just said, is that set of guidelines that work for both students and teachers and faculty. Like it has to, like, I almost think that like when we talk about this, when you talk about, normalizing generative AI use so people aren't hiding it, it means that teachers and leaders also have to do that. So for a PD that I do on this, I actually have an asterisk on my first page on the title that says supported by, created in partnership with ChatGPT. And so the reason why I've done that is because it's actually, I don't want to hide it. It doesn't make me any less of an expert, but it does mean that I'm at least normalizing it so that students wouldn't be hiding it or teachers wouldn't be hiding it. And so I think that that's like a really important part. And then the next piece is you have to socialize that with your stakeholders. Do not expect that you're going to go in and say, hey, here is this policy, and that people are going to do it. We're really good as educators of like being in our own bunker. And I know that is in K-12 and higher ed, we're like, oh, but they'll forget, or it's a hype cycle, or what's going to happen. And so if I just keep doing what I'm doing, no one's going to pay attention. And then I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And we know right now that that is not the case. Like this is something that is already impacting jobs across industry, specifically white collar industry. And it's something that we can't just leave off. So I'm going to stop there before I keep going. So any thoughts about those first three components of this policy development?
Yeah, I think even from the get-go, that common language is super important. Thinking about what people mean with AI, because I saw in the chat somebody's mentioning like, well, where does Grammarly fit in that? And so really kind of making sure that that's clear, that runs right up with the things we were doing. That clear set of guidelines, important for both students and faculty. There's another aspect that is also like larger of the institution, because there's something else there to consider depending on the institution's mission and how they're using that, and the complicated things we know about generative AI in terms of the ways it can be exploitative and environmentally harmful. The thing that I also want to tie to the previous conversation of the importance of the institutional policy is that if the instructor doesn't have anything, then the student is also protected. And what I mean by that is if there is a policy that the institution has and the instructor hasn't put in a policy, it protects the student from the faculty deciding the policy in the moment, right? It becomes the default if it isn't present. And I think that's also important, because if the institutional policy says they can use it up to a certain amount and they use it, they shouldn't be penalized because the instructor decided when they read it that that was a problem. And then like making sure there's stakeholders involved throughout the process. I would, that's exactly what we did at College Unbound, and I'll probably talk about that more later. So I'll just leave it for there.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll both talk about that. I did the probably the most fun I've had in a while was doing an AI policy session at a Queens high school with students and teachers, and it's still like I wish I could just like bottle it and bring it to everybody because those moments of crystallization and real deep conversation and debate, I think we just miss so much. And so I think that's a really good like we'll definitely talk about that when we talk about the policies themselves. I think the other three things that we want to do is, I mean, I love to see the chat, like, but like we need to identify that, like, if I did this with you, hopefully we'll do this again, Lance, in 6 months, and your list of policies will be 250 or 300. Is that the conversation we will be having then is going to be different than the conversation we're having now and different than it was in January and in November. And that is where it's really important to identify that it is a work in progress, that this is changing, this is something that will be looked at again, that this is a place in which we'll be learning together. Because if you put something in stone and you set it and release it, which we often do, I'm telling you right now, Microsoft Copilot, Google Drive Copilot, we've got coming for TikTok, where, TikTok is going to start giving essay recommendations. I don't know what's going to happen. That we're going to have this real need to have to ensure that this is something that is like going to be reflected on and actually looked at multiple times. And then we always want you to provide examples of policy and stakeholder specific language. And so I mean that it needs to work for educators, leaders, students, faculty, family, staff, whatever it is, but we can't write it in the same way for everyone because it's not going to make sense. Like it is got to be something in which, when we talked about our prompt guide we built a couple of weeks ago, we built a student version because it is different. Like it is like the prompt guide is still the same in the sense of these are the 5 steps, but the way you use it as a student is very different than the way you use it as a teacher. And so I think that that's a really important component. And then the last thing is, this is my favorite. We posted this about this webinar, Lance, on LinkedIn, and someone was great. He's like, well, we've had to change policies over and over and blah, blah, blah. And like why do it's really hard to do. And I totally agree. That's why this has to go hand in hand with AI literacy training. This is not an either or. You can't do one or without the other. You have to train students and faculty and teachers on the capabilities and limitations of generative AI. If you don't do that, then all of the work that you've done on the policy is going to go nowhere because people are not going to actually understand. Like if an old school faculty member, not that there are any out there that maybe still have a flip phone and are like really anti-education, or no, sorry, anti-technology, they're, cool. They're not going to understand the level to which a student is going to be able to take a discussion board prompt and put it into Google Drive, get the API key from ChatGPT, and then do 10 discussion board responses in 10 seconds. Like they are not going to understand that, right? Or on the other end, you're going to have these students that are like, oh man, this is really, really good. And then they're going to not realize that the thing that they have created is hallucinating, that it says something that is not true, but sure sounds like it's true, but it's going to be very easy to identify. If we don't do that, then it's going to just make things and compound them and make them worse. And so it has to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. I'll just say that like the work in progress, it's something we put into both our temporary policy and the one we built out, and with the syllabi policy syllabi AI generative policies that I've been collecting. I'm at a point now where I am seeing folks come back and saying, I'm actually changing mine. And I think that's a really cool part of this. That's a really important part of this that I'm just like, yes, like that's part of what I'm hoping is to see those iterations, semester after semester as folks remember it or want to like update it. And it's, that goes hand in hand with how the tools are changing, right? When we first all started this, it was ChatGPT, and now it's just like I was doing a slide deck yesterday and using Google, the image tool now in Google where I can like have it create an image. So absolutely on that point. And yeah, the training is absolutely essential. I can't not stress that enough. And what I loved seeing in that the language specific examples is also something we put into our policy, because again, like we can't just say it and then be like, you figure it out. We want to make sure people can understand and know where the pitfalls are for them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can see, like, I know when we think about it, we think about like the K-12 and higher ed, but for K-12, we think about parents being a very core component of this. But I could see the need of having like a freshman version of this document and a senior version of this document. And I think that that's like, because of the perspectives are going to be quite different, you're going to be needing to think very strategically as a senior about the workforce. We just published a video today on Ethan Mollick and his team did a piece around the impact of AI on work, where when people got access to ChatGPT as consultants, like BCG consultants, these are very accomplished students. I'll say students. I don't know how accomplished they are in the real world yet, but like they have to be like from, these great colleges and they've got a lot of schooling. But what they found is that like the access to ChatGPT actually made them not only better at what they did, the higher quality, but it made them faster. And those that were low performers became like the skill gap collapsed. They really got to a point where they were on par with top performers just with 5 hours of access to ChatGPT and a bit of training for some of them. But then on the other end is that when they gave them a task that was not very good with AI, it actually made them less accurate because they felt like, so the people that didn't use ChatGPT were able to find the nuance in the documentation to answer the task accurately, maybe not the same quality. So like the ChatGPT users did a really high quality wrong answer. So it was very convincing, but it was wrong. And so I think that that's where we really want to see this, is that your seniors or like when you think about higher ed specifically, is that this is coming right now, but you can see how easy it is to subvert like the natural progression of what we think work is with these tools, and also create spaces in which people start to trust them implicitly very, very quickly because they look right. And if they look right 10 times, but they're wrong 11, like that 11th time, doesn't mean that we're going to be as critical that 11th time and we can get comfortable. And so that's why I think this idea of partnering the academic integrity policy with the training is so important, because you wouldn't be able to talk about that, without having those two things together.
And I would add in terms of using it in classrooms, is a thing I've encouraged, is like red teaming, where you have two groups of students like generate stuff with AI around the course content, and then it's each team's job to like poke holes and like figure out what isn't working in that, as a way of both like making them better analyzers and critical thinkers, as well as deeply building in the concerns about to the degree that the tools will be right all the time.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we're going to shift over to like, let's see it. So I saw some people that were like fangirl or fanboy about your repository of AI policies. This is the man, the legend. This is Lance Eaton, who put this together and took the initiative to do this. And so I'd love for you to share your screen and talk a bit about this, show the repository, maybe show a good example. And then what we'll do is the same thing for K12. I'm going to turn on my light because it's getting dark. So I will just be off camera for one moment.
Sure. I'm gonna share my screen, and then I'm gonna do a bunch of links dropped into the chat. I won't necessarily address all of them, but these are things all around the work that's been going on. So back in January, in fact, I have the date here, January 16th, I created this, and I created this as a like, other people are going to need to figure this out. Our semester started January 9th, and many other people started later. So I was just like, let me put something out there for people to use. And this was it. This was me just like Google Docking my way through life, as I do, like open access, make things available. That's just like where I'm born and bred. And I was like, how do I make this in a way that people can see it and also contribute to it? And so if you look at the document, it's listed chronologically. In that way, it's okay. It's not like you have to kind of look around, but something I did recently was actually update it into a spreadsheet so that folks can actually sort. And so you get onto the landing page, it kind of tells you a little bit more, and then you just go to the policies. And now you can actually sort by discipline. One of the other things I did recently to add to this was to go back to people that had submitted and ask them about rights usage. So you will start to see some folks that have had or included their what kind of rights they're associating with it. So a lot of Creative Commons. a whole lot of folks are putting it in public domain, and like you are my people. So thank you for that. It's really cool. And like again, you can go in and sort, you can go and find your disciplines, you can find, comparative colleges or folks that you're familiar with, and just go in and learn and see. I think it's been so cool. Like every time I go into these two documents, like I see there's 30, 40, 50 people in here. Another thing I wanted to just share, and again, it's in that link drop, is that this was our policy development plan. And again, this is something that I started to put in place back in January. And so first it has some information, but it had the goal in the outline of like what we were going to do about it. And so if you're looking, as you're starting to figure out your own policy, this idea of like, how do you do it? We started with a temporary policy that I just put together as quickly and as clearly as I could. I went to doing some staff training, some faculty conversations, and then I actually ran 2 courses on AI and education where with the students, we crafted the policy that we thought would be the right usage policy for students and faculty at College Unbound. In session 1, we created it. In session 2, we actually had students test pilot it. They would look at the guidelines and they would try to use ChatGPT within the parameters of those guidelines for an assignment in one of their other courses. And then we use that to revise them. And then after that, we had faculty take a look at them, give feedback, and we're on the cusp of them being approved as our institutional guidelines. And so it's been this really powerful process, and the students have just been amazing. So there's that. Those examples or our like policy use, our proposed policy usage is another link in this document. And speaking to what Amanda said, like we have some areas of definition. We have the space where we talk about student guidelines and then faculty guidelines. And then we go into the more specific details, again, making sure we have language that's geared towards students. In one of these areas, right here. So one of the things we say, students are responsible for the negative outcomes, and we highlight, like we give examples, we specify what does that mean, what does that thing look like, and then we do the exact same thing for faculty. And we start off with like faculty may develop their own usage expectations, right? Making sure they have that academic freedom. And also there's things they can't not do, which is like they still have to follow the process highlighted around academic honesty. And then finally, I just put this in there because folks might be interested. This is the syllabus and its Creative Commons license of the course that I taught, if people are interested in playing around with or thinking about that at their own institution. And then finally, because I can't not encourage, this is a piece by me, Anna Mills, and Maha Bali. They are 2 amazing people about the work all of us were doing since January in the ways open educational practices were helping us figure out generative AI. And I think that's an important piece for me that I can't not reemphasize, is how valuable it is to be in community, whether it is, Twitter for as long as it's around, and some hopefully less, as little, anyways, or Mastodon or LinkedIn, but really finding community of folks to be doing this work in. So just put those things out there. As I said, they're in the chat. By all means, like almost all of them are open access licensing. So take what you need.
Well, first of all, you're getting all the love in the chat for good reason. I think this is the idea, though, that when you give it shape and structure, you start to understand what's possible. And I think that so much, like we talk about, the empty page is the hardest, right? Which is really funny because ChatGPT is quite good at filling a page. But what happens is if you see what's already happened other places, you can take and pull. And because we are in an unprecedented time, there's not this place or compendium of things that have happened in the past. So you're going to need to reference open educational resources, or the work that we're doing is really the amalgam of like our background around research, education, and ed tech. Like the reason why I think that we're doing work that resonates is because we're thinking about it from the different angles. But it's still like every time we create something, we don't know how it's going to land because it's never been created before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do from the K-12 perspective. And so when we think about K-12, you need a, like, so Lance did a beautiful job of, like, I think that if you're in K-12, please use that resource, but it's probably a bit too complicated. And most of the academic integrity policies at the higher ed level will already be significantly more robust. Whereas at, most likely you have at your school or system a handbook, and that handbook has a section on academic integrity. And so for this case, what we have here is like what we think about when we put together a policy. And so this is the idea that, like, there are three kind of key areas. One is like, what is the appropriate use of Gen AI tools? Like, what are the types of assessments that can be AI assisted, or those with teachers' approval, and which can be completed without, or should be completed without generative AI. And we don't want to make this a binary, because sometimes what you want students to do is, like, you want them to learn potentially on their own and then use AI, or the other way around, because you're looking at building skills, you're looking at assessing. There's all types of different components of building this mastery as we build student learning as they cross, the K-12 landscape. The second is this idea of normalizing, tracking, and citing generative AI. And I put traffic tracking in here very specifically because it's not going to be like that. The dog ate my ChatGPT, history. Like, we're not going to do that. Like, we need to be very comfortable to share our prompts and how we use that, because it also is a way that's a really good teachable moment or teaching tool, is like, how are you actually using these tools and can we improve them? So we want to make sure that we normalize that students not only need to cite their use, but they also need to track it so it can be shown and shared. And the last thing is, like, we really think it's really important for data privacy and security to be part of these pieces. Like, you do not put your own information into these bots. So please don't go in and say, hey, I'm a ninth grader and blah, 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 or a teacher saying, I have 5 students with IEPs, here are their names and there are their issues. And so we don't want that to be something that is normalized. So this is what we want to include. And what we did is we built a very basic piece, and Dan from my team is going to put this in the chat. It's a one-pager, and you may have seen this in some of our sharing or on our website. Well, we just wrote this very simple piece that said that situates like what generative AI is. So, and we also make sure it's clear that it's not just ChatGPT. It's not eponymous, but it's a significant technological advancement. It has the potential to support your learning. But with any new technology, there are significant limitations and risks associated with its use, misuse, and overuse. And the reason why we wanted to kind of put that out here is that A, is about agency, that students are not going to, we don't want this to be something where students are like hammered, like, you must do, but like, why is this actually important for you to understand? And like, what does it mean for you to choose how to use these tools? Because if you're going to cognitive offload literally everything, we're going to have problems. And so, for example, we did a webinar back in the beginning of this webinar series with 15 to 18-year-olds. And one of the students said, if a teacher can teach me that vaping is bad, they should also be able to teach me that ChatGPT can also be bad for my brain. And so, like, he knew, like, the first time he ever used it, he used it to essentially cheat and didn't really think of it as cheating. And then had a moment where it's like, oh man, did I use that in a way that was not very ethical? And so this is something that we really need to think about, but it's about the misuse, but also overuse of these tools. And then finally, it's this idea that there's steps to be taken. We could have written a 17-page document about the pros and cons and all these things, but what we wanted to do is actually say, like, there are 3 steps you need to take. And the first is that you need to ask. You need to ask your teacher if this is appropriate. If it is, go for it. If it is not, you do not use it. And so, first of all, we need to have that conversation and set that scene. And it needs to be normalized, where a teacher doesn't automatically think that if a student asks, they're going to cheat, but they can see the value in these tools to help students ideate, to help them brainstorm, to help them refine their work, etc. The second is, if it is allowed, you want to track your conversation, and we give some examples because it's K-12, like, actually cut and paste it if you don't. And then you need to be able to share it with your teacher. It doesn't mean you'll have to. And in fact, it's kind of a little bit of a panopticon where if you do it, students know it needs to happen. But it is this great learning tool where you talk about red teaming, like, hey, let's look at the prompts you did. Like, I'd rather, like, instead of I'm grading the final assignment, I'm going to grade how you used AI to get to that outcome. And we're going to evaluate your prompt generation. We're going to evaluate your critical thinking, your resilience, because honestly, it could take 8 to 10 prompts to get something usable. So are you resilient? Do you have grit? Are you asking good questions? Are you showing critical thinking? But it's there for the 2 pieces of, like, students can show what they did responsibly, but also we can dig into that. And then the next thing is, like, cite the use of the tool. And I saw some in the chat saying that we overly focus on this, but it's just nice to have and, like, normalize. And one of my favorite conversations, Lance, that I've had recently was, but it's ChatGPT is like, do we have to cite parents or tutors when they help a kid? And I'm like, I actually think it wouldn't be a bad idea. Why can't we say that like this was actually helped in this way? Why can't I cite the help I get and normalize that this is something in which a lot of our learning, a lot of our work is actually done with support, and that ChatGPT is another type of support. So we do that, and then we have these. Okay, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Well, I want to complicate that a little bit. So like I agree the citing piece, like the initial conversation was like, how do we cite it? And I think that like that will figure itself out. I think that there are some interesting questions behind that actually Maha Bali brought up when I was another gathering with her, where she made this point where she was asking ChatGPT about a particular set of ideas that have been generated by a particular author. And in this case, it was an author who was writing about white supremacy culture in particular ways. ChatGPT like gave these very, very specific answers that align like line for line with this author. Then when she asked ChatGPT who like, where do those ideas come from? Like ChatGPT is like, I don't know. And then when asked ChatGPT, who are authors that are writing in this domain, like all of a sudden that person's name shows up. And I think that is a little bit of the bite that is really challenging, is that at times it is going to mask and deny credit to people, and particularly in academia, where like credit and citing is the quote unquote coin of the realm, that it becomes a tool that in this case like was a really good example of like, here is in this case it was a person of color who is being denied citations, when we know in higher ed, like in terms of who is given more access to pipelines to tenure or to be cited, like there's all sorts of inequities there. So like I'm just going to throw that out, like we're not going to solve it, but like that as a thing that like within higher ed, that's also worth some conversations about.
Absolutely. And you'll see that we actually, in the next piece, we actually say not to use generative AI for research for that reason specifically. Also copyright and there are some really deep ethical problems. And if you listen to me enough, you hear it all the time. So we totally agree. But remember, these tools are predictive. They are computing, not thinking. So it doesn't act like when it says something similar to that author, it actually doesn't know it's that author. What it knows is that there are things that have been out there and they can predict based on probabilities that, but it doesn't even know it wrote it in the sense of that moment in time. So it becomes, like you said, very complicated very quickly, but very important. And I just want to show like this example of appropriate and inappropriate use. And what you're actually going to see is that like we really look at, like, again, K12, specifically 13 to 18 years old, because that's the only tools available to those students are ChatGPT, and most of them are under 18 is off limits. But we want you to understand that there are places in which it can be appropriate, like explaining topics in a way that you understand. We have a great prompt on that. Help me brainstorm and explore ideas, help me study for an upcoming assessment, that idea of spaced repetition. Give me feedback on this essay before I hand it in so I can make it better, or I can understand how to do that live in person, especially if my teacher is over rotated to only pen and paper. And then provide feedback on how I can improve. But then inappropriate uses are just not asking for permission. Like, we just need to ask for permission. Like, it's like, can I use an encyclopedia? Is this an open book test? Like we do that. We don't just open our book, we ask for that permission. And so that's going to be really important. We don't want it to complete an entire assignment, homework, or assessment. For example, going back to that paper we talked about at the beginning, what they found is that when people got really comfortable with the AI, they did something called retainment, where they literally just copy and pasted almost the entire, like 94% or something crazy. And so we don't want that to be the outcome, even when even with prompting, like we really want it to be something that you're critically looking at. And we don't want you to just say, hey, write this assignment, but like how we get there, and then making sure it's our voice and that we're actually creating that final product for ourselves. We're not reviewing for hallucinations or inaccuracies. It can't do math. Please don't have it do math. Don't let it quote people or cite people or ask it for a URL. It's not going to work, and it's going to be embarrassing. And then finally, not tracking or citing that work. And to the point that you brought up, we created this like flow chart. And what you'll notice is that I actually get a little bit of feedback on this, that on the very end of those kind of worked examples of here are some appropriate uses. And we want it to be like a step process. It's not just like go do like, hey, Lance, yeah, you can use AI, go to town. Like, no, like we want it to be that same structure over and over again, because we know that that's going to actually build like these habits of mind. But then what we see is we actually put like fully complete, but also find like helping with research and find facts, quotes, or resources. And the reason why we do this is because it's not that it can't help, but like you said, it hallucinates, it cannot cite, it can like be plagiarized. There are all kinds of problems that come about this. And it's not connected to the internet, the majority of these tools. And so I was really happy. I don't know if you saw this today, Lance, but like now with Bard getting an update, which is Google's large language model, you can hit a G now. So the Bard is not the best. I'm going to tell you guys right now, if you're a Google school and you're using Bard because you have to, let's think about critically. But anyway, you can now ask it for something, you hit the G, and what it'll do is it'll use search and it will highlight that it can actually say is real and what it's not. And so it doesn't actually mean that it's 100 the things that it's not real, it can't find, but it at least gives you a degree of confidence that some these things are not hallucinations. So I think there's a really nice like path forward in which there are going to be these opportunities to have like better like places in which it does say that wonderful author who you should include in the chat, because let's give her some high fives. But it is going to be something that I hope that eventually we're going to see these more ethical or more reliable systems as it becomes more mature. I think you're on mute.
Oh, yes. No, this is really cool, and I think about like what is the. It will be interesting. What is the version, or what here gets adapted for K through for higher ed, and what gets adapted for faculty? Because I think that's a there's a real unspoken element there where as somebody who did the adjunct shuffle in the late 2000s, where I was teaching 9 face-to-face courses and 2 courses online and working full-time overnight to like make ends meet, like I can't not say that if this tool showed up at that point, I wouldn't be using it to like, let me do grading, or like, let me use it in certain ways to design like my lecture or things like that. And so I think there's an interesting one to think about with faculty, and it's the same issue, but it's on a different scale of like discernment, right? Because if you're a faculty member, it means you've demonstrated, I'll put in air quotes because I just find it a loaded term, but like mastery over a particular subject, right? You're a subject matter expert. And so we give more credence to that, but there's other implications of using that. And I think for me, I am of the like, there should be parity in the classroom. So a few years ago, I wrote an article called the new LMS rule, and I feel very much with generative AI is the same thing. It's like you can't on one hand say students can't use it, but then you can. In the LMS, it was like you can't be allowed to see every single thing a student does in the LMS without you being able to see, without the students being able to see every single thing that the instructor does in the LMS. And that's an important piece, especially as we're dealing with adult learners and we're dealing with really that space. If we want it to be its most powerful, the agency needs to be more distributed.
Yeah, and so you gave me a great idea. So we'll be building one of these for faculty, because I think about this all the time. Like I think about like, okay, I'm going to tell you right now, if you're building an AI grading tool, I'm so sorry. I am not a fan right now. And I saw that Perry did a great job of saying like where things are moving fast. But like right now, I am so worried that an overworked adjunct or an overworked teacher says, I have 150 papers to grade, and they're getting this drafted feedback and they are not reviewing it, or they're using it as a final draft and like they only draft. And what ends up happening is the same way that a student would write something and then they ask, oh, hey, Lance, what did you write about? And you go, whoa. And then, but what happens when you grade someone's paper and they say, I didn't actually write about this. Like, why are you giving feedback? Because the thing about hallucinations are, it happens a lot when you ask it a question and it's not in the document. So if you had a rubric that said something around evidence, and then in the piece, it has nothing about evidence, it won't say a 0 and there's no evidence. It will most likely say something made up, because it will fill in the blank.
Yep.
And so we have to be really, really, really careful. And I think that that's an incredibly important point that you get in. So maybe soon I'll give Lance the credit and get you to review it, but we'll build a version of this for faculty and teachers. We started a little bit late. And so I really appreciate everyone joining. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to actually give Lance opportunity to kind of give a last word. I'm going to put up also our LinkedIn's. This is how we met. Lance and I met on LinkedIn. And so we're very on LinkedIn. I know that I talk to people from all over the world. I know that Lance also is very open to it. So connect with us there. But yeah, I just want to leave with a second or a couple minutes on what you really think needs to happen for generative AI to meet its potential in the sense of where we're going in higher ed and just in education.
Whew. Is that all?
Yeah,
No.
just a little question.
Yeah. Simple question to end on. I mean, I think it's hard because again, it continues to iterate. I think there's ways I see it as like I think about it in its most like coolest, amazing form. It is we all have this helper that like is more attuned to our learning than I think we really give credit for. So like a lot of the research on learning I find is flawed because it's so much of our in higher ed, like we sacrifice what may work for convenience. And I give you the example of the 3 hour course, right? We have the 3 hour course theory, like we lose so much learning in that because nobody is meant to learn for 3 hours with like 1 15-minute break. And
Yeah.
so there's ways I could see and hope that generative AI starts to become the thing that helps us understand like and I'm thinking of it like connected with like wearables, which gets a little surveillancy. Yes, absolutely. And also like if we can better understand when individually we are primed for our best learning, in that it could happen in like those small, as we talk about micro learning and things like that, and it could happen at different times that are more attuned to our own cycles, like that would be amazing. Like that would be the beautiful thing of like, oh, at that moment the system knows to deliver this lesson and it's 30, it's a minute and it's going to give us a question to think about. So to me that's like big pie in the sky of like that would be so cool and it would help so many people kind of move through and feel more grounded in the things that they're learning. And I just see it as this like I always go back to like Foucault when I talk about this of like Foucault, which is funny for surveillance reasons, but like, man, if I had this in grad school, I might have actually understood Foucault. Like I tried to read Michel Foucault's History of
Yeah, right.
Sexuality for 10 years. The only reason I got through it was because of an audiobook. But like it was so hard, and to be able to like have a tool that I could keep asking questions, because when you're in a grads class talking about Foucault, like you can't show your ignorance. Like you just like you're already ashamed because you're like, I don't have the secret decoder ring to figure this out. I'm not gonna be in front of a bunch of other people. 3 or 4 are like big. Walter and Benjamin are the same. Right? Like
I have a ton. I
yeah.
didn't finish my PhD. I am a failed doctoral candidate because I don't understand philosophy. I don't know if I should be saying this. Dan will probably yell at me later. I legitimately hated academic writing, which is very funny because I did it a lot after I left the PhD program. But I honestly, if you give me whatever, I'm sorry, we're gonna get overly jargony here, but if you give me this, my brain actually, it's like another language and I cannot see through it. I
Mhm.
can't. And that's why I didn't finish my PhD, is that I could not write in someone else's voice or understand philosophy. And so I totally agree. If I had generative AI when I was in the grad school program, I would have gotten a doctorate, and
Mhm.
my grandmother would be very happy with me right now. But I do think that this is an opportunity not just to give you that space in which you have the on-demand piece, but you hit something so interesting on the head, which we'll kind of wrap with, is that this idea of generative AI doesn't get bored, doesn't get
Mhm.
tired. It's not going to think that you're asking dumb questions. It's not going to care if you're black, white, purple. It's not going to care about that. What it's going to try to do is just predict and make you believe it. And so it was going to do it with varying degrees of success. So what we hope to have for you all, we loved how amazing the chat was and how everyone stayed with us and came with us considering the technical difficulties. So thank you so much. I also want to say thanks to Lance. This just feels like, honestly, you and I are just hanging out and having a conversation, because you guys, there might be a couple, 60 people here, but Lance and I would just be sitting here doing this on our own because we
Facts.
really love this subject. So I just really appreciate your insight and wisdom.
Hmm.
And then also, I just want to say thank you. We had people from all over the world, whether it's the morning, the afternoon, the middle of the night. We just appreciate you being here. And if, just keep doing the good things and learning, because that's all we can do to ensure that we have this responsible adoption of AI that we're working so hard for. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Lance, so
Thanks,
much. And
folks.
everyone have a great wherever you are.